We are continuing our lecture series of 2021-2022 about law and literature, literary representations of identities and legal transcriptions. Like said, better said, François Host in his book Droit et littérature, variété d'un champ, fécondité d'une approche. Between law and literature, the links are numerous, deep, and personal. So there are those dangerous relations between law and literature. The imaginaries of law and literature are adversary, are divergent. Law codifies the social reality, sustained hierarchical choices, creates regulatory fictions about people, and generalizes what is essentially particular. But literature instead opens the social perspective, explores plural ways, creates emancipatory fictions about characters, and singularize what is apparently common. So today we are giving continuity to our lectures, and we'll welcome you all to discuss with us today and receive our professor today with is Saskia Vermeylen. She has a background in legal theory, and she critiques the extension of liberal property discourses into new and accelerated property regimes with a specific focus on outer space. Her research is strongly embedded in literary studies with a focus on African feminist futurism, cosmism, eco-criticism, and science fiction. I can't wait to listen to it. And her work also extends to visual and performative arts, including creating, commissioning, and developing site-specific arts. Well, Professor, I welcome you to this Laboratoire de Cyberjustice. Hoping that you come to visit us in better time, and especially if it's not in the winter. We are sure they will be very welcome. Just extending to let you know that we're going to invite you again. And I'm really interested in your conference. I did a bit of my science fiction, my thesis too, that I concluded this year, was all well done. But I left, for example, everything that is Afrofuturism, I left for a moment, so I can't wait to listen to you. Thank you. Feel free to start your conference.
Okay, thank you very much, Cristiano, for that. First of all, for the kind invitation to present my work, and for the very kind introduction. And thanks for everybody in the audience. So maybe before I start with the paper, it could maybe be useful just to give a little bit more background about my research, because I'm not a space lawyer, so it's a bit of a journey how I got actually into this topic. And it seems that I'm kind of reinventing my research every 7 years, and I'm just starting a new cycle. But I started my research into property through legal anthropology and legal pluralism, and I've studied property relations and property theory in Southern Africa for quite a while now, and I've worked with nomadic hunter-gatherers in Namibia and Botswana. But from there, I moved into a more theoretical from the legal anthropology and legal pluralism more into a theoretical understanding of property, and I've just finished working on a monograph, sort of developing a new property theory using Emmanuel Levinas's theory and philosophy to rethink property not as something with sort of exclusive rights, but more about issues of generosity, reciprocity, etc. And it's through kind of a continuation with the Levinasian work that I've done, and also the methodology that I've used for the manuscript, that I sort of got interested in space law. And it's kind of bringing together all my interest, also all the work that I've been doing in Namibia and Botswana with hunter-gatherers and different ontologies and different ways of understanding property that I'm sort of bringing into space law as well. So that's just to situate myself a little bit and how I come into space law. So I will now start with the presentation. I don't have slides. I had all sorts of technical issues this week with Zoom, so I decided to play it safe and not try to do too many things because I also need to have my notes. So I'm just going to present the work, but without any slides. But if there's any need for further clarifications, please feel free to send me an email later or in the Q&A. We can pick up maybe some of the things that may need some further clarification. All right, so principles that have governed space explorations under the auspices of international space law are increasingly being questioned through the development of a commercial space sector. The 1967 Treaty on Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, which hereafter I will refer to as the Outer Space Treaty, still holds. But through the changing landscape of space travel, the current body of space law has to address the new challenges that are being faced through the activities of new actors and institutions in space. As the Outer Space Treaty is a legal instrument that was negotiated during the Cold War and the geopolitical landscape has since changed considerably, it's timely to reflect about the future governance of outer space. But there is also a wider unease about the moral value of international law that I seek to explore further in this talk. As the third world approaches to international law, or short, Twill School argues, international law does not always deliver on its promises. On the contrary, it behaves more like a hegemonic power that seeks to protect the interest of the powerful. According to Twill scholars, international treaties are steeped in a legal tradition that is Euro-American centric, which limits the options for a genuine change. International law for them, the Twill scholars, is a practice that universalizes and institutionalizes inequality and inequity on a global scale, by prescribing standard economic solutions to fight against an unequal world. Therefore, Twill scholars call for international lawyers to become more critical of the colonial discourses that are still embedded in and are part of international law. I argue that for outer space law to live up to the expectation that the exploration and use of outer space should be for the benefit of humankind, we need a more progressive textual analysis of its core legal principles. In order for space law to become more inclusive and just, the colonial property and appropriation regimes that are currently underpinning space law must be subverted. The value of departing from the usual doctrinal and positivist legal method in international law opens up the opportunity to inject a much needed conceptual, theoretical, and moral inquiry into the study of international law. By adopting a literary approach, critical discourses will emerge, which in turn offer new possibilities to think in a more progressive manner about the future of space law and governance. More specifically, I'm interested to study the relationship and link between utopian literatures and space law in order to move beyond the positivist legal interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. In this talk, I am particularly interested in the utopian but also dystopian visions that are adopted in science fiction. I'm obviously not the first scholar interested to study law through science fiction. For example, a paper by Bruce Rockwood in Legal Studies Forum illustrates how the narratives of Star Trek around international or interstellar disputes provide jurisprudential insights about treaty interpretation, state succession, diplomatic relations and immunities, international dispute resolution, membership in international organizations, law of the sea concepts, international environmental law, terrorism, extradition, extraterritorial jurisdiction, asylum and war crimes, and the list goes on. But I would like to push the relationship between space law and science fiction a bit further, inspired by the idea of the literary critic Edward Said, who provocatively proposed that without empire, there is no European novel as we know it, end of quote. Following on from this, Joseph Slaughter, professor in comparative literature, argues that a similar codependency exists between international human rights law and the Bildungsroman. Slaughter detects a resemblance between the bourgeois subject in the Bildungsroman modeled according to German idealism and the narrative grammar in international human rights law, which positions the ideal vision of the white male citizen as an exemplary for a universal subject in human rights law. In a similar manner, science fiction literature has also influenced space law. Virgilio Pop, researcher at the Romanian Space Agency and prolific space law scholar, introduced already in 2001 the idea that there is a close relationship between space law and science fiction. But unlike my own attempt, Pop does not necessarily engage with literary studies as a legal methodology. Instead, his work highlights how the launch of Sputnik was a charismatic event that influenced and forged a deeper relationship between science fiction and space law. Now, anyone who has worked with science fiction literature may well know that it is often treated as the odd one out in literature studies. In literary circles, critics such as Darker Suvan makes a clear distinction between science fiction and fantasy, arguing that the latter is nothing more than imaginative literature and, unlike science fiction, should not be defined as a literary genre. In order to draw a clear demarcation line between science fiction and fantasy, literary scholars have drawn upon Marxist and socialist utopian thoughts to define the specificities of science fiction as a genre. Science fiction and Marxist utopian literatures share the idea that society is changing, often as a result of technological and scientific developments. Both science fiction and Marxist utopian literatures are looking for alternatives through a social imagination that is simultaneously critical and utopian. This means that unlike the popular belief that utopianism is a blueprint for a better society, utopianism is rather characterized by its ambiguity, on the one hand shaped by the dominant ideology of capitalism, on the other hand also formed by the oppositional ideologies that have pushed against the contours of capitalism. What political utopian studies share with the literary genre of science fiction is avoiding any vision of utopia based on a blueprint of how a perfect society should look like. Instead, both react to a specific charismatic event that sparks and calls for an utopian imagination. For most space law scholars, this charismatic event that prompted the dialogue between legal and utopian visions has been a successful launch of Sputnik. However, as I will show in this paper, by moving the novum, or the event, further back in time to the transatlantic slave trade, a more progressive and utopian reading of space law is starting to emerge. But let us first focus on Sputnik. So the event that prompted the need for space law was a successful Soviet launch of the satellite Sputnik 1. Celebrated as a triumph in the Soviet Union, it caused hysteria and paranoia in the United States and its allies in the West. The American space program was defeated by Soviet technological supremacy. Feeding into the fear into the United States was the idea that the Soviet Union could replace the satellite by a nuclear warhead. Sputnik very quickly symbolized the possibility that the Russians could build ballistic missiles that could erase America or its European allies from the world map. Sputnik prompted the legal urgency to develop a corpus juris specialis, the visions that strongly emerged from the report of the ad hoc committee on the peaceful uses of outer space in 1959, the Declaration of Legal Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space of 1963, and the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 were a clear break with previous principles of colonialism that led to the division of land masses. The image that appeared in space law was one of harmony, supporting the idea that humanity could work together to improve the lives of all humankind. This could only be achieved when the exploration and use of space resources was for the benefit of humankind and in the spirit of cooperation and harmony. What I should also mention at this point is that at the time of these negotiations, the countries in the global south were fighting for their independence and were very concerned that the history of colonialism, imperialism, and mercantile capitalism would be vertically extended to other planets. For the purpose to secure a future in space for the benefit of all humanity, with all the nations of the world coming together under the umbrella of the UN, space law emerges as a constitution for cornucopia. The golden age science fiction dream of a technological future of peace, affluence, and world government becomes in space law a legalized goal. It specifies the rules for the sublimation of humanity in the stars. However, this cornucopian deployment of law as an instrument to guide the future does not originate from a cornucopian assessment of technology. Sputnik is closer to dystopia. As a cornucopian imagery, it proclaims the ultimate conquest of nature. As a dystopian vision, though, Sputnik reminds of the panopticon, the ultimate technique for surveillance and control. Sputnik symbolizes the technical possibility of a panoptic society, the spy in the sky, collating and reporting details of suspect groups, peoples, societies, or even countries. Consequently, it could be argued that the utopian vision in Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, that the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic and scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind, may be well-founded on a well-founded terror for the other, rather than the lofty ideal to break with colonialist practices. To control the fear for the other, the international community included the explicit prohibition of extending state sovereignty into space, addressing the fear that colonization and nationalism could ruin the possibility in the future to use space and its resources as the next economic frontier. So Sputnik may have contributed to the idea that space law must protect space from any claim of sovereignty. However, there is also a reluctance in space law to provide a similarly bold and ambitious vision how to regulate and govern the exploitation of natural resources in space. The dream of extending Western frontier thinking that is a familiar trope in Golden Age science fiction is also embedded in space law. The entrepreneurial and expansionist spirit is kept alive in the Outer Space Treaty through the use of vague rhetorics and ambiguous deployment of language in Articles 1, 2, and 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. These articles are failing to mention explicitly the prohibition of individual appropriation or acquisition by private association or an international organization of space and its resources. This lacuna has created an opportunity for the promulgation of national space laws, allowing national citizens engaged in asteroid or space mining to possess, own, transport, use, and sell extracted resources. And the US and Luxembourg are two prominent examples of national space law being enacted in order to allow individual property rights over resources mined in space. Reflecting upon these developments to regulate the governance of space and its resources through national laws, Marco Verrazzani, legal counsel of the European Space Agency and director of the International Institute of Space Law, made a point that in order to protect the main idea that every nation should be able to benefit from the use of space in a peaceful manner, international organizations must continue to play a role in the normative, executive, and jurisdictional function of international space law. This cautionary comment alludes to the ongoing debate between space lawyers, whether the national laws of, for example, the United States and Luxembourg, allowing the possession, use, and ownership of space resources are indeed in breach with the Outer Space Treaty. From a doctrinal perspective, the answer to this question has become quite polarized and rather unimaginative in its opposing views. Therefore, I propose to use the literary critiques and approaches to analyze existing space law. Marxist theorist critics such as Tom Moylan, Frederick Jameson, Carl Friedman, and Darko Suvin provide a literary critical lens that can help me to understand the ambiguity of space law that on the one hand seeks to protect the use of space and its resources for the benefit of humankind, but on the other hand defers the completion of the utopian vision to protect space of commercial exploitation. For Tom Moylan and Darko Suvin, science fiction and utopia are both literary practices that, and I quote, estrange and critique our present-day world. Darke Suvin perceives science fiction as the literature of cognitive estrangement and the novum. Starting with the novum, this signifies a total break from the present. It is inspired by Ernst Bloch's theorization of utopianism, which epitomizes a desire for the future that is new. Bloch centers his ideas on the paradoxical. Utopia is not present in the here and now. It exists in the future. The future, though, is not an extrapolation based on a chronological forecasting or an expression of progress. It is rather an expression of our deepest hope and most radical longings. These longings can never be achieved by the fulfillment of an individual wish or personal wealth. They are so radical that they require a revolutionary reconfiguration of the world as a totality. The novum of a science fictional text, and I quote, is defined by its creation of a new world whose radical novelty estranges the empirical world of the status quo, by Friedman. A quote by Friedman. This does not mean, though, that the novelty is completely cut off from the empirical world of actuality. The utopian aspect is embodied in the ultimate object of hope. Utopianism is more than just the novum. It also requires cognitive estrangement. Estrangement is an underlying and formal device in science fiction. Norms are unique and changeable and are subject to a cognitive view. Science fiction is fixated on the variable and changeable elements from the empirical environments. Events and phenomena are explored in science fiction, first as problems, then explored where they lead to. Through the concept of cognitive estrangement, science fiction's formal device is an imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environments. So argues Suvin. Applying these ideas of novum and cognitive estrangement to the Outer Space Treaty, I can only conclude that space law failed to break clearly and decisively with the empirical environments of our property institutions. Although attempts are made in the Outer Space Treaty to step away from privatization and private property, the legal execution fails due to the lack of a strong and unambiguous language that prohibits private property. This has opened the door for national legislation to reinstate the idea of private property as an incentive to develop and mine in outer space. From a literary perspective, for space law to live up to its utopian ambition, it had to be bolder in its language and had to make it explicit in the treaty text that the international community step back from the notions of propriety and the proper, because these concepts inform in the first place discourses of sovereignty and property. Instead, the international space community left the door ajar for national laws to reinstitute private property through their national laws. As I will discuss in the next part, the problem for this unfulfilled utopian ambition in space law can be traced back to the choice that was made about a paradigmatic event that would accelerate the promulgation of space law. The dystopian angst of Sputnik may have clouded utopian ambitions. In the context of tracing the utopian aspect of space law, or the lack of it, it is particularly Fredric Jameson's critical reading of utopian texts and science fiction that can provide some useful explanations why outer space law failed in its utopian ambition. First, Jameson shows us the representational limitation of science fiction as a genre because it lacks the means to offer a radical authority. We do not have the cognitive tools or the language to break completely with the practices and structures that shape our daily existence. Second, science fiction as a genre shows us that we do not have the constitutional ability, according to Jameson, to imagine utopia itself. This is not because we are short of imagination or do not have the means. According to Jameson, our lack of imagination and speculative vision is, and I quote, the result of the systemic, cultural, and ideological closure of which we are all in one way or another prisoners. For Jameson, the political function of science fiction is to show our incapacity to imagine the future. Science fiction, therefore, produces the future to a completion of our own absolute limits. Applying Jameson literary criticism to space law shows painstakingly the pitfalls of our international legal system. Although the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and its legal subcommittee claim to be fully aware of the uniqueness of space from a legal point of view, it has though refrained to protect space from the possibility of commercial exploitation. Outer space law is almost like a textbook example of Jameson's critique that humanity is by definition short-sighted and incapable of thinking about another future in space. At the time of the negotiations in the United Nations about the future governance of space, the arms and technology race between the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, overshadowed other paradigmatic events that were unfolding at the same time. I argue that the failure of the Outer Space Treaty to imagine a utopian legal future of hope in space is a reflection of the silencing in law of the history of dehumanizing the African slave and the denial of the existence of Black cultures, knowledges, and ontologies. As a side comment, I focus in my work mainly on the slave trade because of my long-held research interest in the colonial genocides committed on the African continent. But I am, of course, fully aware that First Nations, Aboriginal Australians, and other Indigenous peoples have equally been silenced and dehumanized. But the silencing of Black histories, knowledges, and bodies in outer space law is part of a wider and ancient agenda that has, in the words of Cherie Renee Thomas, plagued the African community since the first ship left with stolen lives. I seek to bring in the African voice not through a twill approach, but rather I find Afro and African futurism to offer a more exciting and progressive angle to destabilize the proprietary and colonizing tropes in space law. To close the door on an expansionist worldview that haunts humanity, we need to break with our capitalist and mercantile vision about our presence in space and reopen and rewrite first our colonial history on Earth. As Gedwu Ashun writes, and I quote, "Reopening the past is a form of revision that consists of exposing the white conspiracies that covered up the stolen legacy of American science." According to Afrofuturists, African slaves were the first modern subjects, even postmodern, in that they were the first subjects to experience the dissolution of their world, a radical ontological instability and a form of madness side to the dehumanization produced by slavery. From this perspective, I would argue that the birth of space law is far more dystopian than what we led ourselves to believe, and has lost its utopian moment for reparative writing. Afrofuturists have compared the voyage through space with the Middle Passage. The poet and queer activist Alexis Pauline Gumbs make this argument compellingly in her book M-Archive. Inspired by Afrofuturism and the poet Audre Lorde, she comments, and I quote, "They had this thing about darkness, the bottom of the ocean, outer space. They were afraid of it. They wanted to penetrate it. They wanted to pretend it only existed in contrast to light. And then there was something about not wanting to have their eyes closed, not wanting to go within. Lightweight enlightenment equaled mass Black death." Space law needs new images of tomorrow, but in order for these images to be progressive, they must draw from, but also redraw the past. A past that begins not so much with enlightenment, but with darkness. It must retell the origins of erasure, the ontological certitude of being human, the concept that is centralized in space law as being the guarantor to protect space from darkness and exploitation, is, according to Ashun, a pointless and treacherous category. The Middle Passage has made the enlightenment and the rationality of the human circumspect. Outer space cannot be modeled after modernity. The utopian element for outer space law is to let go of the enlightenment and use the estrangement of the aliens as a tool to becoming present. As Africans have already been abducted, they can use that experience to rewrite the past so that the future of space law is about the becoming present of those bodies and histories that were erased. Space law is not about governing our relationship with technology, but is about becoming fully human by estranging the history so the impossible becomes possible. And law is no longer ontologically white, but is liberated from its own past and becomes a creative space where the proper is a person of color and where propriety is no longer about ownership, but about generosity, reciprocity, and a feminist ethics of care. And this is where I would like to end the paper.
Well, first, thank you very much. I have to confess that I read some about it, but never in this perspective. So I'm very glad to listen to Evan for being here, and I can't wait to listen again. In fact, to take some notes, especially those from Jameson. So yeah, because Jameson would say that we can imagine the end of the world, but not the end of the capitalism. But yes, we can imagine. About mining space. That's one of the points. I think that one of the hottest topics right now in this year, because this year we experienced the travel. Let's say with those three companies. Also, we are seeing the privatization of space, and that's where I would like to make you the first question, because I would have more questions about the method, about theory, but I really have to ask you about this, because even if I'm not in space law either, but now the way we're seeing this new approach to space is a private approach with in this sense a modern approach for a postmodern problem that we don't have even the modern imagination to solve the problems that the science fiction already posed to us for quite some time. So I wanted to ask, I have a huge curiosity about what you think about those last images that we had with SpaceX, with this object that Bezos launched to space already twice, and also the initiative from Virgin, the owner of Virgin also. So yeah.
It makes me quite worried, and also in a way disillusioned that it seems like all the mistakes that we've made on this planet, that we haven't learned from them, and that history kind of repeats itself. And particularly in the sort of artwork that I analyze for my legal work, I work with a lot of artists who are questioning in their work mining on Earth, and show all the environmental and human rights abuses. And what I find really interesting is actually that I think for a lot of these sort of space entrepreneurs, they see outer space as something that is where we can, that there's not going to be any kind of impact because it's far away. It's this kind of brave new world, but it's not. And I think the entanglements already in terms of like I've got an exhibition coming up where we're going to showcase work of South African widows whose husbands were killed, the Marikana massacre. Some of you may be familiar with that, about 10 years ago. And it's a platinum mine, and a lot of the platinum will be already in space. So I think the entanglements are already there of in terms of the human rights abuses, the environmental destructions that we are committing here on Earth, all the space debris that is floating around. I think we're already sort of beyond that point just to see outer space as this kind of empty frontier where we can just do whatever we think we can do. So that's why I feel that outer space law has missed an opportunity to be firmer, because I think there were some ambitious goals in it. But it has refrained, I think, to be really bold in its language, to make it really very explicit in the Outer Space Treaty that private appropriation would not be allowed. It's clear in the Moon Agreement, but because that has not been ratified by enough countries, it doesn't have a lot of value. And at the moment, there is a big push on the one hand by some space lawyers that we need a new international treaty, maybe resurrect the Moon Agreement, but then we see that there is also a big push to start legislating through national law. And I think that would be, I would not be in favor of that. I think international community, for all the failure of international law, often I think it's still the best option we currently have. But we need something really urgently, because it is happening. It's no longer something in the distant future, but it's here, it's now, and we're just walking into a potential disaster, I think, with our eyes open at the moment, and that's worrying.